Now, some of you are aware that there have been a lot of controversy within scholars, and that my co-chair, Steve Jones, the physicist from BYU, actually, and I had a parting of the ways just in December past, where he became a part of a new organization called Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice. And this really had to do with differences in our point of view about the science and the politics of 9/11. And what I want to do is to explain to you how this divergence emerged and what it amounts to and why it's important. Remember, professionally, I'm a philosopher of science, so I mean, I've only spent 35 years teaching logic, critical thinking, and scientific reasoning, but I've published a lot of books, a lot of articles, done a tremendous amount of work. I have a PhD in the history and the philosophy of science. Science is a process involving 4 steps or stages: puzzlement, speculation, adaptation, explanation. In a case like this, we make observations all the time, but most of them don't have any scientific significance. It's the ones that don't fit in with our background knowledge that we can't readily understand that lead us to focus our attention and try to sort out what's going on. So you have these buildings coming down, this massive amount of dust, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The second stage of scientific inquiry is to consider the full range of alternative possible explanations. They've got to include natural causes, earthquake, hurricane, tornado, human causes that are conventional, like arson, dynamite, RDX, thermite, thermate. Human causes, unconventional, mini nukes, atomic, hydrogen, directed energy weapons, HARP, lasers, masers, plasmoids. Some of this stuff sounds futuristic, but that's because we really aren't kept current as a public body of developments within the military community. DARPA's out there giving these contracts for advanced and exotic weapons, and we don't learn about it. Judy Wood and Morgan Reynolds was the chief economist in the Department of Labor in the George W. Bush administration. He's a prominent Republican. Have created a website devoted to the totality of devastation of the World Trade Center. And one of the observations they have advanced is the discovery that in 1991, the military conducted an experiment with a low-intensity laser being reflected off of a mirror on a satellite located in space back down to Earth, and it came within like 3 feet of its target. And of course, after that, all this experiment and all this stuff becomes very classified, and it's not so publicly accessible. The HARP project is a fascinating one because it's an array, a very elaborate device located in Alaska that can deliver 3.6 gigabytes of energy. I mean, it's just staggering the amount of energy this weapon can deliver. And these lasers, masers, plasmoids, I don't know a whole lot about them, but I'm terribly interested in them because, as I'm going to explain, it looks as though the conventional alternatives simply can't do the job, and we're going to have to look at a wider range of alternatives. Now, Steve just happens to be the foremost proponent of thermite thermate as having been the principal cause of the destruction of the World Trade Center. Well, it turns out thermite is an incendiary device that cuts steel. It's a focused form of energy that cuts steel, kind of like a blowtorch. Thermate is a sulfur-enhanced version of thermite where the sulfur reduces the temperature at which the steel is cut, which means it cuts it even faster. But if all you're doing is cutting the steel, then you're depending on gravity to bring the buildings down. And we already know these buildings were destroyed faster than gravity could have brought about their collapse. So that's something that has troubled me about Steve's work, that I became increasingly convinced during the year that his hypothesis probably wasn't going to be able to explain it. Now he wanted to throw in RDX. RDX is a very powerful explosive. Turns out RDX, however, is chemically identifiable, meaning there are these little tags that are built into RDX, so if you actually had residue of RDX, you could discover who had actually manufactured it. You could figure out the source, and I've yet to see any evidence that RDX was actually used there. So Steve and I, by June already of last year, I was no longer talking about thermite. See, thermite, if you think you have an alternative explanation, that it was done using thermite, then you don't even have to think about the melting point of steel. You don't have to think about the design of the building. You don't have to know that there were explosions in the sub-basement. You can have a simple solution to a complex problem. You can just say, thermate, it's been shown, and you can rest your case. And I'm just here to tell you that that won't do. Thermate can't be the cause. He's gone further to suggest there's a nanotechnology enhanced version of thermate known as super thermate. But we're unable to discern whether or not super thermate even existed in 2001. We have found some contracts by DARPA that were let for what looks like nanotechnology enhanced versions of explosives, but those are much, much later, much more recent. So there's a question about that. And then of course you have to have a catch-all. See that H4, other alternatives not yet considered? Now what's crucial about science is you're reasoning from causes to effects. So you have to look at all the evidence here about the destruction of buildings and the times and all that as effects and figure out, well, what hypothesis about the cause of those effects would bring about those effects with the highest probability. When you entertain different hypotheses in relation to the effects and calculate their probabilities, that yields a measure of evidential support of those hypotheses by that evidence that's known as their likelihoods. I'm being just a little technical here, but there's very little involved. You got the probability from the cause to the effect that equals the likelihood of the hypothesis given the effect as evidence, okay? But you got to assume the evidence is true. So if you got some evidence thrown in there, then that may be something that's got to be sorted out. I mean, in JFK, they altered the X-ray, so you couldn't see this massive blowout to the back of the head. So until we discovered and were able to prove that the X-rays had been altered, they had discounted the eyewitness testimony of 40 different persons to this massive blowout to the back of the head because the X-ray didn't show it. So I'm just telling you, they can alter evidence in the most blatant ways to defeat research. And I'm going to suggest there's some evidence here that we might have to consider whether or not it's authentic. And then finally, when sufficient evidence becomes available, the preferable hypothesis, meaning the hypothesis with the highest likelihood, is acceptable, but in the tentative and fallible fashion distinctive of science. Because if you get new evidence, new hypotheses, you may have to reassess the likelihoods in comparison and find maybe the new one is better than the old one. You may have to reject something you previously accepted, accept something you previously rejected. This is typical of science. So now I just want to briefly survey the key features of the evidence that have to be accounted for by a defensible hypothesis that would explain what happened here. First of all, look at the selectivity of the damage. This is obviously inconsistent with a tornado or a hurricane or a typhoon or what have you. It just is as though they wanted to take out all and only the buildings with a World Trade Center designation. Second of all, look at the peculiar effects here. You got these buildings that are kind of carved out as though there's a surgical form of destruction, just like taking that kidney out of my body. This is quite bizarre. How are we going to account for that? Here's that World Trade Center 3 with that enormous gouge in it. How are we going to account for that? Here are those toasted cars again. How are we going to account for them? And these cars that are wrinkled like beer cans, right? This is not, you're not actually looking at the debris from a fraternity party. These are actual vehicles on the streets of Lower Manhattan that were warped and mangled by what has to have been some powerful, massive source of energy. And look at the destruction, this conversion of these buildings into this very fine dust. This is astounding. Look at that. Look at that. Ask yourself, where did all that dust came from somewhere? That dust did not spontaneously appear. That dust represents the conversion of buildings by some powerful source of energy. So Judy Wood did a calculation, which is typical of her work. I mean, she's very precise. She is, in my opinion, as I'm suggesting, the most qualified individual to ever study the case. And she said, suppose the building's materials were reduced to 10% of its original volume, okay? Then how much dust would you find if it were 10% of the original volume? It would turn out to be the equivalent of 2.5 inches deep over 1 square mile, or 1 inch deep over 2.5 square miles. Or suppose that the building's materials were reduced to only 5% of the original volume. You get 1 inch deep over 1.25 square miles, or the equivalent, okay? And that's about what we find here. Look at this. There's a street just completely coated with dust. And think of this poor hapless fellow. He's had to clean that up. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the situation you would have been in to clean that up? Look at all that dust.